Character Diary: The Boar and the Bitch. 6 years ago. Falkas walked the halls of Kaport Castle. He and the rest of his unit were called here by Prince Haldir Torquan, sixth in line to inherit his family's seat. Over the years, he'd taken a liking to the Boars, and to Falkas especially. So much so that he had taken full command of the unit, using them for missions important to Haldir and his family. When he first heard this, Falkas was excited, foolishly thinking he'd earn more pay. He was wrong, of course. Not only did he not get paid more, his missions had become increasingly deadlier. But honestly, he shouldn't have been surprised. House Torquan was notorious for their utter disregard for anything other than themselves. Prince Haldir was a bit better, but not by much. Since Falkas's last mission went off without a hitch, Haldir thought it fitting that he and the rest of the Boars be rewarded with some rest. During their stay, they were given just about free rein of the castle. Some spent their time out in the training yard, running drills with Quincy, the master-at-arms. Others spent their time lounging in the gardens or gorging themselves in the mess hall. But Falkas sought something else. He finally reached the double doors, opening them with barely contained excitement, and entered Kaport Castle's library, Prince Haldir's pride and joy. The other members of the Torquan line mocked Haldir for his love of script, saying that his time would be better spent practicing warfare and strengthening his faith in Hexter. But if anything, his love for books was one of the prince's more admirable traits, not that he had many to begin with. Falkas moved through the aisles of bookshelves, looking for something that caught his interest, as he was not needed for anything at the moment. Eventually, a book's title caused him to pause. The Lineage of House Torquan. He never spared much thought for Haldir or the rest of his family. As far as he was concerned, they were a bunch of cruel bastards who'd rather behead a man than pay him a decent wage. But it would be interesting to know about their past. If he was lucky, he might discover something that they themselves didn't know. Which, considering they aren't the biggest fans of reading, let alone history, the odds were very likely. Falkas skimmed the pages. Most were accounts of different family members and their deeds, and found himself surprised. Previous Torquan members did not worship Hexter, but his brother Heronius, god of chivalry and justice. A few members of the Torquan line were even members of the Knight Protectors, an order of knights who protected the Old Kingdom before its collapse. What had happened? Falkas got his answer in the name of Saint Kargoth Torquan, the only member, as far as Falkas could tell, that held the title of saint, along with the Betrayer and King of the Death Knights. Falkas' interest was piqued. He found a nice chair to sit in and began reading. Kargoth was originally a knight protector, like many of his ancestors. Originally known as Kargoth of Mansbridge, he was a paladin of some renown, defending the hamlet of Bitterhollow from a goblin invasion. He, along with his brother-in-arms Benedor, were among the finest that the knights had to offer. But rarely do men keep hold of their benevolence, for when Benedor was chosen to lead the knights, Kargoth cast his aside. Jealousy took root where righteousness once did, leading to Kargoth's seduction by the demon prince Demogorgon. The prince promised to grant Kargoth the power he craved in return for his service. Kargoth agreed, and so had the flesh stripped from his bones, turning him into the first Death Knight. Kargoth would tempt 13 of his brothers to fall as well, turning them into Death Knights under his command and dubbing them the Apostles. Together, they would go on to wage war against the Knight Protectors, an event that is often attributed to be the end of the Order. It is said that Kargoth met his end at the hand of St. Benedor of the Ashen Hand during the siege of Castle Farlanst, but no body was ever found. As for the Apostles, some say they still roam Airdrie, looking for a way to return Kargoth to life once again. As Falkas engrossed himself in the book, he did not notice Merioleth enter. She was dressed in black-tinted plate paired with a crimson tabard displaying the symbol of Hexter, a fist holding 6 arrows pointed downward. She cradled a great helm in her underarm while resting her mace, Black Thorn, on her shoulder. It was an ugly thing, with the appearance of a black rose encased in its own thorns. Falkas pretended not to notice her, humming obnoxiously as he continued to read. Not able to stand being ignored, she cleared her throat. Finally, Falkas looked up, noting she'd changed very little since the last time he'd seen her. Fair skin, stunning red eyes, and long, silky black hair all lent themselves to the illusion of beauty. Falkas knew better. No, she was a cruel harpy of a woman, a trait she would make clear when the two had first met. Bandits had begun raiding the roads around the town of Edgefield, the local lord. Wendell Rosewood had requested that the Boars look into the matter, sending his daughter Merioleth with them to ensure everything went smoothly. She did quite the opposite. She had no patience for espionage, scouting, or anything that didn't involve smashing someone's head in. She was a brute, plain and simple, but what else could one expect from a paladin of Hexter? Since Falkas was given charge of the operation, he got to spend a lot of time with her. If one good thing came out of the whole ordeal, it was watching Merioleth squirm at having to take orders from a commoner of all people. When the bandits were finally dealt with, Falkas had thought he was rid of the woman. Sadly, he was wrong. Falkas closed the book and put on his best smile. I was wondering why the room had grown so dark. Then I saw you. My reading light must have fled when it saw you approaching. Very funny, pig boy. Did you come up with that yourself? Ever since she found out Falkas's unit was named the Raucous Boars, Pig Boy had become one of her staple insults. Sure did. Now, is there any reason why I'm stuck looking at your face? Which, by the way, seems to be sporting a few more wrinkles. I heard frowning does that to you. Falkas got up and returned the book to its shelf. Prince Haldir has a mission he needs done. Merioleth's voice carried a tired tone. Great. When do you leave? Falkas tried his best to avoid eye contact with the woman, pretending to look over book titles. Merioleth let out a sigh. He wants both of us on it. A silence fell upon the room then, one that not even a library could stomach. Falkas finally met her eyes. He felt a dozen questions flood into his mind, but the only word that came out of his mouth was, "Why?" Merioleth shrugged. Who knows? I was supposed to go alone originally, but he seems to think I need your help. What help some up-jumped pig could offer is beyond me, however. I've got a pretty face, which is more than I can say for you. Falkas let out a sigh and ran his hand through his hair. What's the mission? Merioleth produced a scroll and laid it out onto the table. Spies managed to intercept some field orders from a Garisteth scout. Apparently, they uncovered a powerful artifact and are transporting it to Castle Highlander. The report is short on the details, but it's obvious they want it badly. Reluctantly, Falkas asked, "What are the mission specs?" Merioleth answered with a little too much enthusiasm. "We are to obtain the artifact no matter the cost. Haldir doesn't want this job traced back to him, so no witnesses. Once we have it, we are to return immediately." Falkas nodded. The no witnesses order could be interpreted in a few ways. Falkas's favorite was, make sure no one sees you. But knowing Maria, he doubted stealth was an option. They didn't call her the Bloody Thorn for nothing. I'm assuming we're to leave immediately then, Falkas asked. Marioleth smiled. Looks like you're using your brain for once, pig boy. We've got a carriage waiting outside the castle. Get your equipment ready, you have 10 minutes. With that, she turned on her heels and exited the library. By the hells did he hate that woman. Falkas donned his signature armor. Black studded leather with the Torquan symbol painted on its chest. A black dragon eating its own tail. He packed lightly for this mission, bringing an arming sword, a rondel dagger, a light crossbow and bolts, rope, and a tinderbox. Marioleth was by the carriage, her squire presenting her with her kite shield. It had the rosewood crest painted onto it, a crimson rose wrapped around a tree on a black field. It was sunset when the two left Caport Castle, and by the time the carriage stopped, it was dusk. The two didn't speak the entire trip, which was fine with Falkas. The pair exited the carriage and began their mission. The driver had left them on the outskirts of a small forest, the dim lights of campfires glowing from within. Marioleth began to lay out a plan for an assault, but Falkas paid no mind, leaving her behind as soon as she began to speak. Besides, he'd move quicker if he didn't have to wait for her to stumble through the woods. He creeped closer to the source of the flames, finally stopping at the edge of a small cliff. About 30 feet below him, Garasteth troops had made camp in some ruins from the Old Kingdom. Taking a quick count and judging by the number of tents, Falkas guessed there were about 10 to 15 men in the camp. Numbers that did not favor a full-on assault. Their only saving grace was that their equipment was bare bones, most men being armed with spears and gambesons. They obviously weren't expecting an ambush. Then again, who was? He had been quick to make it here. He could dwindle their numbers before Marioleth began her assault on the camp. When that happened, he would support her, and then the two would be free to search for the artifact at their leisure. His stomach churned at the thought of helping her, but a job's a job. Besides, the sooner they were done, the better. He began his descent towards the camp, moving within the sloping forest that flanked the cliff. When he felt he had a good position, he readied his crossbow. He scanned for potential targets. Once the first bolt was shot, he'd have to switch to hit and run tactics. He finally settled on a man who he assumed to be the commander, as he was the most heavily armored, dressed in a chainmail hauberk. Falkas aimed at the man's head, careful not to rush the shot. But before he could pull the trigger, he heard a horn blow in alarm. Damn that woman! Marioleth had been faster than anticipated. Falkas's target began to bark orders to some troops, standing still as he did so. How polite. The crossbow bolt made its home right in the man's head. Falkas reloaded and then slung the weapon onto his back, making his way into the ruin. On his way in, 2 guards had spotted him and moved to intercept, likely watching their rear for multiple attackers. The spear's reach would have Falkas at a disadvantage, plus there were 2 of them. The pair stood shoulder to shoulder and slowly advanced onto Falkas. He'd have to separate them. Luckily, they did that for him, breaking away from each other to rush Falkas on both of his flanks. These men obviously weren't trained well. Falkas ducked under a high thrust from his right, just in time to meet the one from his left. He dodged to the side, grabbing the spear by the haft and severing it with his blade, turning at once to parry a follow-up thrust from the foe to his right. Falkas pressed him, moving past the spear's reach and striking at the man with his sword. The soldier dodged backward and in doing so lost his balance, falling to the floor. While the soldier scrambled to his feet, Falkas turned to meet the other attacker, who was drawing a sword of his own. The two engaged in a quick exchange of blows until Falkas landed a riposte that opened the man's throat. He fell to the floor, clutching at it, blood streaming through clenched fingers. Falkas heard footsteps behind him and turned just in time to duck under a sword swipe meant for his head. Falkas then launched himself toward the man, blade point forward. It pierced the padded armor easily. Warm blood sprayed Falkas' hands as he drove his blade into the man's stomach, shoving him away with his shoulder and leaving him to die in the mud. He continued into the camp to find Merialeth surrounded by about 5 corpses. She had donned her helmet and met the bulk of the camp's forces, about 7 or so, with mace and shield in hand, and was using them to great effect, batting away a soldier's spear with her shield, and then breaking his wrist with a well-placed strike. The man only had a second to scream before the mace slammed into his face, tearing away his lower jaw and sending it flying into one of his comrades, who flinched at the sight. Merialeth pounced on the opening, planting her mace into the man's skull, its thorns ripping away clumps of scalp and hair. Her eagerness left her open, however, as a soldier flanked her from behind and managed to land a blow on her back with his sword. Merialeth let out a grunt. The armor would have kept her from any serious harm, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt. She turned and slammed the edge of her shield into the bridge of his nose, breaking it and sending him to the floor. Falkas rushed in to support her, stabbing a soldier in the back, severing the spine and killing him instantly. Shocked, the soldier next to him turned his attention to Falkas, only to have Merialeth's mace slam into his chest. His sternum broke with an audible crack as he was sent flying, landing 5 feet away. The last 2 soldiers stood frozen as they watched the carnage. When Falkas looked their way, they threw down their weapons and dropped to their knees, begging for mercy. If she heard their pleas, Merialeth showed no sign of it. Instead, she walked toward them, mace and shield held at her side. Falkas didn't fail to note the holy crimson aura that began to surround her mace, implications of Hexta's favor. A cruel god indeed. Thankfully, their deaths were quick, a blow to the head for each of them. Merialeth shook her hair free from her helmet, murder's pleasure quickly giving way to anger as she met Falkas's eyes. "Next time you leave before hearing the plan, pig boy, I'll crack your skull open." Falkas cleaned the blood off of his sword with a rag as he spoke. "So eager to spill my brains, Meria? Are you that desperate to see what intelligence looks like?" Merialeth, too simple to make a comeback, simply growled and nodded towards the bodies before them. "Was that all of them?" Falkas nodded. "I think so. We might have a few stragglers, though. So keep an eye out." "Any notion of where the artifact might be?" Merialeth knelt down to inspect the corpses. Falkas shook his head. "I was too busy saving you to look. Besides, it's not like we were given a description of the thing. I guess we'll know when we see it." Merialeth nodded, gesturing with her mace past Falkas. "You search that side of the camp. I'll search the other. Yell if you see anything." Falkas gave a mock salute. One Merialeth did not return, and began to work. Falkas had a talent for finding hidden things. In fact, that talent is what got him this job. He started his search with the tents, finding only the usual items: spare boots and clothes, rations, pots and pans, and other mundane items. He eventually found a lockbox in one of the larger tents, and like its name would suggest, it was locked. Being the absolute genius that he was, he assumed it belonged to the camp's commander, who most likely had the key. Falkas exited the tent and tried to locate the man he had shot when the fight first began, finding him with little effort. Much to Falkas's pleasure, his hunch was right, as he found the key upon the dead man's person. As he pocketed the key, he heard sobbing from behind him. Falkas turned to look, noticing it was the soldier he had stabbed in the stomach earlier. He was on his side, clutching at his wound, tears clearing a path through the mud that covered his face. Falkas walked over to the soldier and knelt down in front of him, getting a better look at his face. His heart sank when he did. The face before him was young, no older than 16, probably some poor peasant pressed into service. A boy who knew nothing of war, nothing of what he was fighting for or what he was dying for. Falkas eyed the boy's wound. Judging by the smell he had stabbed him in the bowels, it would be fatal if he didn't receive any healing. Marioleth had the ability, but he doubted she'd even spare thought for this poor lad. Falkas drew his sword. He'd give the boy a quick death. He felt a tug on his trousers. The boy's grip was limp, and with a quivering lip he mouthed the word, "Please." The boy obviously hoped Falkas would save him, but the best thing Falkas could offer was mercy. He was quick, sliding the blade into the heart before he even knew it had happened. Shortly after, his whimpering stopped. Falkas wiped the blood from his blade and returned to the chest with key in hand. Inside was a femur bone with ornate golden caps at both ends. Across it were runes in a language Falkas didn't understand. Unless the commander was a fan of macabre trinkets, this was the artifact. He returned to the killing field to look for Marioleth, who was busy checking the bodies of the fallen. She noticed his approach. "Did you find anything?" Falkas tossed the bone to her, who caught it with infuriating grace. "That should be it," she nodded. "I agree. We're done here then. We'll set fire to the tents and make it look like a raid. You brought a tinderbox, correct?" "Yeah, it should be in my bag." Falkas looked down to rummage through his pack when he heard plated footsteps lunge toward him. He moved his hand to stop the mace's motion, but was too late. The mace slammed into his side, thorns piercing the leather and cutting into him, his attempted block only softening the blow. He let out a groan before swiping at Marioleth with his sword, forcing her back. "What the hells are you doing?" Falkas held a hand to his side, blood eagerly pooled into it. Marioleth wore a smile that could curdle milk. "Oh, don't be so surprised, pig boy. This has been a long time coming." "And when they find my head mysteriously caved in, who do you think they'll blame?" Falkas asked, inching away from her. "Oh, Falkas, you make it sound like there'll be a head to find." Marioleth's voice was a hiss, venom present in each and every word. Falkas tried his best to steady his breathing, but it was in vain. With the battle prior and the wound in his side, he was exhausted. "Now then, shall we continue?" With that, Marioleth charged. She came at Falkas with an overhead swing, eager to end the fight in a single blow. Falkas sidestepped, letting the adrenaline carry away his pain. Falkas noticed she neglected to put on her helmet and swung at her temple, but she swatted it away with her shield, making a follow-up swing in an attempt to shatter Falkas's arm. But he saw her perform this same move in the fight earlier, quickly bringing his blade down for a parry, the clash causing his arm to shake. He backstepped, and she pursued. She attacked, he dodged. He countered, she blocked. A dance of death with both combatants stealing the lead from one another. He'd fought armored opponents before. The trick was to let them tire themselves out and finish them off while they were exhausted. Only problem was that Falkas was exhausted himself, more so than Merialeth. His options were limited. She outclassed him in terms of strength, so parrying her strikes wasn't an option, but he couldn't dodge forever either, not with that wound in his side. The fact that she had neglected to don her helm in this fight was the only saving grace. Likely thinking she'd make quick work of Falkas. For once he was thankful for her arrogance. If he could create an opening, he could cut her throat, ending the fight in an instant. Due to his attempted counters earlier, Merialeth was being extremely cautious, attacking from the cover of her shield. It was time to get creative. Falkas placed one hand to his wound, cupping it and letting the blood pool into it. He backed up into a ruined wall, letting his exhaustion show. He would only have one shot at this, assuming Merialeth took the bait. She did, approaching Falkas like a wolf cornering its prey. She swung wide at his skull, which is exactly what he wanted. He ducked under the strike, flinging the pooled blood out from his palm and into her eyes. She screamed, blood stinging her eyes as Falkas rushed to her rear, kicking out the back of her knee, causing her to kneel. He had her. He placed the blade right at her throat, but before he could open it, he heard metal ringing through the air behind him. Falkas shoved Merialeth away as he flung himself to the floor. Shortly after, one of the soldiers' spears embedded itself into the ruined wall, right where Falkas's head was. He looked to his right and saw another figure in full plate. But unlike Merialeth's oppressive black armor, this shined like silver. The figure called out as it approached, a man's voice. "Well, well, what do I have here? 2 little dragons a long way from home. Lord Garasteth will be very interested in you two." As he got closer, Falkas could see the handle of a great sword peeking over the man's shoulder. He freed it from its scabbard and pointed it toward them. "You have the pleasure of facing Sir Ferredern. Surrender, and you may live." Falkas rolled his eyes. Last thing he needed was another self-absorbed meathead. He looked to Merialeth, who was already rising to her feet, rubbing her throat. The blade had nicked her when Falkas shoved her away. She gave a look to Falkas, one that said, "We'll finish this later," picking up her shield and mace off of the floor. Falkas considered the knight's offer. He had no wish to die for House Torquan. If it were up to him, they'd surrender. But with Merialeth involved, one thing was certain. There would be no surrender, win or lose. Falkas sighed, rising to his feet to support Merialeth, who had begun her assault on the knight. Much like with Falkas, she attacked cautiously, careful to not expose herself when she struck. The strategy went poorly. The knight's greatsword, combined with his strength, was more than enough to break Merialeth's defense. In addition to the blade's reach, Merialeth had no chance to mount an offense. But while the knight was able to knock away her shield, he could not land a hit on Merialeth. Her footwork was keeping her alive, keeping herself close enough to strike and far enough away to evade Ferredern's blows. An impressive feat, especially for one in armor. But she wouldn't be able to keep that pace for long. Sooner or later, she'd slip or mistime a swing. Once that happened, it would be over, for her and for Falkas. Seeing as he liked living, Falkas moved in to pull some of the pressure off of her. Though at getting a better look at him, Falkas wasn't sure how he'd do that. Ferredern was dressed head to toe in plate armor, with chainmail underneath, making slashing weapons practically useless. His vitals were greatly protected as well, a closed armet helm with a narrow eye slit, as well as a gorget meant that cutting the man's throat or stabbing him in the eyes was unlikely. He considered falling back to use his crossbow, but the erratic nature of the fight made the risk of friendly fire too high. Falkas would have to put his effort in letting Merialyth land a blow. With her mace and strength, he had no doubt that she'd be able to wound the knight. Falkas made a strike, though ineffective, at the back of Faradern's knees, hoping to unbalance him and give Merialyth the opening she needed. But Falkas lacked the strength for such a blow, blood loss leaving him weak. The knight whirled on him, the blade making a wide arc that Falkas nearly avoided too late, the sword making a shallow cut across his temple. Merialyth moved to strike while Faradern was distracted, but he had let the blade's momentum carry him as he turned around to face her and slammed the weapon's pommel into her back, sending her to the floor. Faradern knelt down on one knee, turning the weapon's point downward and gripping it by the blade to leverage a thrust. Before the blow could connect, Falkas rammed his shoulder into the knight, all his weight put behind one shove. Faradern was sent away from Merialyth to slide across the floor, but not before Falkas could feel his shoulder crack as it clashed against the steel. Falkas held his shoulder with one hand, wincing at the touch. No doubt it was broken. Faradern rose to his feet and moved to engage Falkas. Falkas took a quick look at Merialyth, who was taking longer than he'd liked to get to her feet. The blow did more damage than he'd anticipated. Seeing no other choice, he rushed in to meet Faradern, letting his adrenaline carry away the pain in his shoulder. Though he didn't know what he intended to do, he still had no way of harming the man. Faradern swung down towards Falkas, who dodged to the side, only for the swing's momentum to carry the blade back around as Faradern turned it point first, making a thrust attack. Falkas slapped the blade to the side with his own and moved in to close the distance. Faradern met the maneuver with a swing. Falkas fell to his knees and slid under the attack, past his opponent. As he did so, he looked up and noticed the opening he'd been looking for, the underarm. There was a large artery located there that, if so much as nicked, the recipient would lose consciousness within a minute due to blood loss, a usual target for knights when their fights inevitably devolved into wrestling matches, the winner usually being the one who manages to work a knife beneath the plate. Falkas was embarrassed he hadn't thought of it sooner. He still had his dagger in its sheath at the small of his back. The narrow and slender blade of the rondelle would be perfect for the job. The only problem was getting in there. Falkas had no way to force Faradern to the ground. Every attempt so far was ineffective. He'd have to try to get him to commit to a swing that exposed the weak point. But if Falkas failed in his attempt, Faradern was unlikely to give him a second chance. Falkas rose from the floor and took one last look at Merialyth, who was still in a daze on the floor. No, he'd have to finish this alone. Seeing no alternatives, Falkas settled on creating an opening. It was risky. One misstep and he'd be cut in half or beheaded. But this was a do-or-die situation, and if he didn't do something now, he'd die anyway. He rushed back into Faradern's reach, who greeted Falkas with a low swing that threatened to cleave him in half. Falkas parried, chipping his blade and spraining his wrist in the process. Lacking the strength to negate the swing, he moved with its weight until the swing reached its apex. He moved closer then, Faradern half-swording his blade to compensate for the distance. His swings were quicker now. One came right for Falkas's neck. He leaned back, pretending to slip as he did so, falling to the floor on one knee. "Come on, take the bait, you bastard." This was a hefty gamble. In his position, Falkas's options for defense were limited. With his blade chipped, it wouldn't be able to handle the stress of another parry. He couldn't backstep or jump out of the way either. His only option was to roll to the side to avoid an attack. He was a vulnerable target, and Falkas hoped he was attempting one as well. If Feradern attacked with a swing, Falkas was dead. But swinging that greatsword around would be taxing on a man. With that, and the armor, Falkas was willing to bet Feradern was feeling the weight of his equipment, and not wanting to exhaust himself further, would likely abstain from swinging. Seeing that Falkas was hardly a threat now, he would go for a less straining attack, either a thrust or an overhead. Falkas had bet everything on the latter, as it required the least amount of energy, letting gravity do the work for you. Feradern approached and raised his sword over his head. Bingo! Just as Feradern brought the blade down, Falkas sprang to his feet, unsheathing his dagger with blinding speed. He slammed into the knight's chest, adding his body's momentum into the thrust. His shoulder screamed as it crashed against steel for a second time. The pain left Falkas deaf to everything else around him, and it surprised him when he felt his face hit the muddy ground. He had put the last of his energy into that last attack. He'd be unable to fight any further. Deep breaths pressed his chest against the floor while both his side and shoulder ached. Falkas looked down at the hand that held the dagger. It was red, from tip to handle. He allowed himself a smile just before losing consciousness. He was surprised when he woke up. He lay there a moment in disbelief before pushing himself up off the ground, shocked to find that his broken collarbone and the wound in his side were completely healed. Once on his feet, he was met with the sight of Merialyth sitting on top of Feradern's corpse. His once pristine armor was now muddy and crimson, the morning sun shining behind the two. Just how long had he slept? "Have a nice nap, pig boy. If you're quite finished, we still have a job to do," Merialyth said as she rose to her feet. "Did you heal my wounds?" Falkas asked incredulously, inspecting the gap in his armor where the mace had struck him. "And you're supposed to be the smart one. Who else would it have been?" She wore a mischievous smile on her face. "But why? Earlier today, you just tried to kill me." Falkas was having trouble accepting the fact that Merialyth would help anyone, let alone him. Her smile faded. "You could have let this dog skewer me." She turned and gave the corpse a solid kick. "But you didn't. I was simply returning the favor. Don't expect it to happen again." Falkas nodded, taking the whole situation in. "Do you still have the artifact?" He was relieved when Merialyth produced the femur bone. "Then let's get the hells out of here. The sooner we're back at the castle, the better." Merialyth let out a laugh. "That might have been the smartest thing you've ever said." She put away the bone and walked beside Falkas, the pair making their way to the stagecoach in silence. Falkas spent the ride back impatient. He was eager to get back to the library and read the rest of his book. He suffered through a debrief that felt like an eternity, and when it was over, he rushed through the castle halls, disregarding suggestions of rest as he practically sprinted back to the library. But when he returned to where he had placed the book, it wasn't there. He spent an hour searching the entire library and found nothing. The book was gone.